Welcome to Tales of Wild West. The wind carried the scent of old earth and dry lavender as the town gathered in silence outside the chapel. Shadows stretched long across the dirt road, and the sun, a slow, bleeding orange, touched every wooden wall of Hallow Bend with reverence, as if it too was unsure what it was witnessing. On the church steps, the preacher's hands trembled slightly around the worn leather Bible, though his voice betrayed no doubt when he spoke. He buried and married half the town, but never like this. Elira Holt stood at the altar and addressed the color of a pine forest before snowfall. Silk, though time had folded it softer than it once was. No veil. No flowers. Her silver hair was twisted up with stern elegance, each pin in place like a soldier holding the line. Her spine, though touched by age, stood proud. 71 winters had not bent her. The cane she sometimes used remained leaned against the wall, forgotten. Or defied. The man beside her was half her age and twice as worn. Caleb Dane had the posture of someone who'd never been inside a church without hat in hand and apology in heart. His jaw was unshaven, and his boots were 2 days past falling apart. But he stood beside her without shame, without smugness, without spectacle. Just quiet eyes and a heartbeat slow enough to catch the weight of every glance thrown at him. No music played. No smiles stretched. The townsfolk had gathered like spectators at a funeral. A murmur passed now and again, laughter muffled behind gloved hands. Poor thing's gone mad. He'll spend her gold before the frost comes. What a joke. It rolled off Caleb like dust off old denim. He wasn't here to be liked. He never had been. The preacher cleared his throat and asked the questions with no poetry. Elira said, "I do," with the steadiness of a verdict passed. Caleb responded with a low, near voiceless, "Yes, ma'am," and offered his hand, calloused and sun-marked, to hold hers. There was no ring, only a soft touch, like strangers passing each other at dawn. It ended as quickly as it began. The crowd lingered, waiting for a kiss, for something scandalous or foolish to confirm what they already believed. But Elira turned from the altar with a nod and stepped into the sunlight. Caleb followed, matching her slow pace, boots thudding like apology against the wooden porch. Outside, the silence hung thick, broken only by a crow's lazy cry overhead. The carriage waited, black and dust-streaked, drawn by a tired mare and driven by no one. Elira placed her hand on the frame, but before she climbed in, she paused. She looked up at Caleb, not with affection, not with contempt. Just assessment. "This house is yours now," she said quietly. "Not your prison." Then she stepped inside, leaving the door open for him to choose whether to follow. Caleb blinked once at the town behind him. At the faces that would never see him as anything but a joke with boots. And then, without looking back, he entered the carriage. They did not speak for the miles it took to leave the town's edge behind. The fields stretched wide, burnt gold and brittle under the summer's long hand. Fences lined the road like rib bones, and far off, the Holt Ranch loomed, not as a home, but a relic. 3 chimneys stood tall against the sky. Windows stared back blankly. Porch rails sagged like tired shoulders. Caleb had never seen a house so grand or so heavy with quiet. They stopped beneath the cottonwood tree out front, its branches creaking in the wind like old gossip. Elira stepped down and nodded once toward the house. "There's a room made up for you," she said. "South Hall. Second door." Caleb removed his hat, out of habit more than respect, and followed her up the steps. The door groaned when opened, as though surprised to be needed again. Inside, it smelled of cedar and memory. Dust floated like spirits in the amber light. She led him through the foyer where portraits hung, stiff men in military coats, a boy with a fiddle, a child cradled in her arms. All gone. He could feel it, the absences. They pressed in from the walls. Elira pointed toward a closed door and said, "You'll find supper at 6. Or not." Then she vanished down a corridor without waiting for a response. The room was tidy. A bed with a quilt that looked untouched. A wash basin. A window that looked out onto a fenced field with no animals in it. Caleb sat on the bed and exhaled for the first time in hours. He touched the quilt. Hand-stitched. Thousands of tiny threads, made not for show but for keeping. He lay back. Let the silence speak. Let the wooden beams above become familiar. Later, he stood in the hallway, watching the sky darken beyond the front windows. From the parlor, he heard the creak of a chair, then silence. Then a sound that stopped him, humming. Soft. Uneven. A tune meant for no audience. He didn't move. He just listened. Long enough to understand this woman had lived in a house full of echoes for so long, she'd started singing to them. The clock chimed 6. He didn't go to the dining room. He sat on the steps of the back porch instead, watching the evening swallow the land. Behind him, the door opened, then closed. No footsteps. No reproach. The next morning, he woke to find coffee already brewed, and a tin plate of cornbread on the table, still warm. No note. No noise. On the table beside it lay a single iron key. Not labeled. Not explained. Just left there. Waiting. The days passed quiet, stitched together by wind and the hush of chores that no longer had urgency but still demanded dignity. Caleb rose before the sun, out of habit more than obligation. He fixed fences that hadn't held anything in years. He scrubbed rust off a water pump with bare hands and patience. When the front gate sagged on its hinges, he carved new supports from pine and fitted them slow, like he was making something sacred. Elira watched from the window. Not openly, not indulgently, but in those glances that know they cannot afford softness. She wore the same wool shawl most days, the one with the green stitching at the edge, and carried herself through the house like a warden through a half-forgotten prison, her steps echoing on polished wood that smelled faintly of lemon oil and solitude. They barely spoke. But she'd leave things, small things. A jar of salve on the barn rail after he cut his palm. A coat draped over a fence post when the wind turned cruel. Once, a book left on the kitchen table open to a poem about wild horses and forgiveness. He never asked if she meant it for him. She never explained. He began to learn her rhythm. The way she paused before each room, as if bracing for the memories inside. The way she avoided the piano in the parlor, though it was always dusted. The way she lingered by the rosebush that bloomed out front, touching the petals like they were someone's hand. Caleb wasn't used to a woman with silence for currency. The ones he'd known spoke fast, demanded faster, loved with their teeth bared and fingers clenched. But Elira moved like a shadow cast at sunset, long, softened, and untouchable. It was midweek when he stumbled into the family room at dusk, looking for a tool that didn't want to be found, and found her instead, seated in a chair beneath the oil lamp, a framed photograph in her lap. 3 young men stared back from behind glass. All with her eyes. She didn't flinch at his presence. Just looked up and said, They all had his smile. That reckless, impossible smile. Then paused, as if speaking cost more than it used to. My husband died in spring. Sons followed him into winter. And then nothing. He didn't reply. But he stood there long enough that she placed the frame face down and sighed. You don't need to understand. Just don't pretend to. He nodded once and stepped out onto the porch, breathless without knowing why. That night, he couldn't sleep. The moonlight carved lines into the floorboards. He thought of her voice, low and dry as parchment. He thought of the way she held that photograph like it might vanish. He thought of what it must mean to outlive the people who once gave your name warmth. In the morning, he fixed the chicken coop. Repaired the sagging beams behind the shed. Shoveled out a stall so filled with cobwebs, even the spiders had gone quiet. He did it without being asked. Not to earn a place, but to honor the space he was now part of. Elira passed him near noon, carrying a basket of apples and not quite looking at him. I heard music in the barn last night, she said. I wasn't in the barn. Then it was ghosts, she replied, and kept walking. That night, he brought his harmonica out to the steps. Played just enough to color the dark. Not cheerful. Not mournful. Just there. Like breath in winter. The next morning, the saloon boy from town came riding in with a telegram. Caleb caught it at the gate, and scanned it before handing it to her. She read it twice, expression unchanged. Another lawyer trying to buy the land. They always think I'll die before I say no. He didn't ask what she would do. But that night, he oiled the hinges on every door, replaced the nails in the cellar, and lit the lamps without her asking. A wind picked up. One of those winds that sweeps in dust from the canyon and whispers of bad seasons. He found her outside near the rosebush, staring up at the clouds. He wanted to build a second house up on the ridge, she murmured, not looking at him. Said it would be for our grandchildren. Said it like a promise. I used to look up there and see futures. Now I see fire. Caleb stood beside her in silence. After a moment, she handed him something. A faded handkerchief. Inside, a small rusted key, the kind that opens something older than memory. I suppose if you're here, you should know what's buried with the rest. She walked back toward the house. Her steps didn't falter. Caleb stayed by the rosebush, turning the key over in his hand, feeling the weight of it settle in his chest like it belonged there all along. The cellar door groaned like it remembered being forgotten. Dust rose in a thick plume as Caleb stepped down into the cool dark, the iron key clutched tight in his palm. The lantern swung in his other hand, casting long shadows across shelves of preserves and rusted tools, jars filled with buttons and broken hinges, the artifacts of a life once full. But there, behind an old steamer trunk draped in moth-bitten linen, he found it, a narrow door sunken into the stone, barely the width of his shoulders. The lock accepted the key like it had been waiting. The door opened inward with a reluctant sigh. Inside was a room that time hadn't touched. The lantern light flickered across maps pinned to walls, hand-drawn sketches of ranch boundaries and irrigation plans. A rocking chair sat in the corner beside a cold stove. On a table, notebooks, yellowed paper, one still open mid-thought. A sentence half-written. As if someone intended to return. The dust was thinner here. He didn't touch anything. Just stood still long enough to know this room was love once. A dream carved in wood and iron. Someone's promise preserved. A place not of grief, but of intention. When he closed the door again, it was with reverence. Like lowering a casket. That evening, the sky poured itself out in quiet gold. Caleb took the porch steps slowly, his knees aching, boots worn thin. Alira was already there, a steaming cup in her hand, eyes trained on the horizon like she was waiting for something to appear and explain itself. I found it, he said simply. She didn't look at him, only sipped and said. He called it his war room. Said if the world ended, he'd start again from there. I don't think it ever ended, Caleb murmured. Just scattered. For a long moment, nothing passed between them but silence. Then Alira whispered. He was 22. My youngest. Killed in the same month his brother died from fever. I didn't even bury him. Just a telegram. Just folded words. Caleb lowered himself beside her. You don't have to tell me. I do, she said. Because you're the first soul in this house who doesn't pretend those names on the walls are strangers. And because you live like someone who knows how to bury things. The cup in her hand trembled slightly, and she set it down on the rail with care. People say age makes you hard. But it doesn't. It makes you brittle. And I've been brittle a long time. The wind moved through the prairie grass like a hush passing over a crowd. Caleb watched it bow and rise, watched the way light fell like silk across the hills. I think, he said carefully, you've been waiting so long for someone to stay that you forgot what it's like not to be alone. She blinked slowly, as if absorbing not just the words but the gentleness behind them. That night, he repaired the steps leading to the old corral. Nailed each board down with measured grace. The barn doors, long off kilter, got straightened. He found a rusted horseshoe above the stable gate and hung it right again, open side up, to hold the luck in. Alira stood at the window and watched. Not with suspicion. Not with distance. But with something rawer. Something she had long ago stopped calling hope. On the fourth morning of the week, she called him into the sitting room. Her voice wasn't commanding, just steady. She held a book in her lap. A leather-bound journal. Her late husband's. He wrote plans in here, she said. Dreams. How to dig the second well. Where the cattle would move in spring. What kind of man he hoped our sons would become. I used to read it like scripture. Then I stopped. Couldn't bear how much of it never came to pass. She handed it to Caleb without drama. Maybe it'll mean more to someone with hands that still build. He took it. Not for the sake of her trust, but because his own chest felt lighter when he did. They sat there in silence, pages open, past and present folding into each other like dusk into night. When he read the line, "A house should breathe, or else it dies with its keeper," she closed her eyes and said, "He was right. And I've been holding my breath for years." The next day, she walked the garden with him. It wasn't planned. She just appeared beside him, coat buttoned, green scarf wrapped loose around her throat. She bent to touch the rosemary, paused at the gate, and when she smiled, faintly, painfully, it made the whole morning feel like a thaw. Caleb didn't speak of it. He just nodded toward the willow tree and asked if she wanted to see the field from there. They walked slow, without conversation. But by the time they reached the top, the silence between them no longer felt like a wall. It felt like peace. That evening, she placed 2 cups on the table. Not one. And she poured his without asking how he liked it. He watched her across the flickering lamp light. Thought how strange it was, to see a woman begin again, not in youth but in surrender. In choosing to let someone near. As he stood to leave, she said, without lifting her gaze, "When I said this house was yours, I meant it." He paused in the doorway. "But now," she added softly, "I'm beginning to wish you'd want to stay." The floor creaked as he stepped out, but the air didn't feel so heavy anymore. The stars were coming out. He counted 7 before the wind shifted and carried something strange from the east. A rider's shadow in the distance, just beyond the fence line, too still to be casual, too far to be certain. A shape not yet formed, but coming all the same. The next morning, Caleb rode out early, the sky still a deep blue bruise above the land. He didn't speak of the shadow he'd seen, not to Elira, not to himself, but something in his gut itched like a storm coming through dry bone. He circled the fence line slow, checking for breaks, watching the horizon like it might confess something. Nothing but wind and stillness. But the stillness felt thick now, like breath held too long. When he returned, he found Elira in the study, not seated as usual, but standing near the window, clutching a slip of paper in her hand like it had teeth. "A letter came," she said, voice brittle. "Addressed to me, but not signed." Caleb took it and read. The handwriting leaned forward, rushed, as if written in a hurry or with shaking hands. "Elira. He ain't who he says. He came down from Sabre Junction last winter, name wasn't Caleb then. Ask about the fire. Ask what he left behind. You'll see. A friend ****. The words bled into each other like old ink on wet cloth. He handed it back without flinching. "You believe it?" he asked low. She studied him with eyes honed over decades, eyes that had read ledgers, wills, and lies with equal ease. "I don't know. But I know what kind of men write anonymous things." He nodded, grateful. But that didn't change the cold in his stomach. He hadn't spoken much of where he came from, not because of guilt, but because some stories don't have edges to hold without bleeding. Still, he knew Sabre Junction. And he knew the fire. Not his doing, but he hadn't tried to stop it either. He went to the barn, hands restless. Polished every tool. Retightened the saddle cinch. Then, finding nothing left to do, he sat on a bale of hay and stared into the dark corners, where mice whispered and spiders plodded in peace. Elira didn't press him. But something shifted between them. Not mistrust, not yet, but space. That evening, she placed 1 cup instead of 2 on the table. Not out of anger. Just hesitation. Caleb ate on the porch, harmonica idle in his shirt pocket, wind tugging lightly at his sleeves. The next day, he went into town. He walked past the saloon and the general store, boots echoing off the boardwalk like questions without answers. The folks didn't look him in the eye like they used to. He asked the telegraph boy where the post had come from. North Drop, the kid muttered. Same hand as them notes the Holt lady used to get after her son died. Caleb froze. What notes? The boy shrugged. She got letters once a year. All unsigned. Started right after that one son vanished in the war. Back at the ranch, Caleb found her in the garden, kneeling beside the rosebush like a woman tending a grave. I went to town, he said. Your letters. I think they're from him. She didn't look up. He died, Caleb. All the reports said so. They buried his name with the others. He crouched beside her. I think he lived. I think he ran. And I think he's been trying to come back in pieces. Her hand shook against the soil. Why would he hide? Caleb didn't answer right away. Maybe shame. Maybe fear. Maybe he thought he wasn't worth your forgiveness. Her breath caught, audible and raw. He was a boy. I told him to be a man before he was ready. Then punished him when he failed. You didn't fail him, Caleb said gently. I failed all of them. Silence pooled around the rosebush. The earth smelled of old rain and root rot. He reached into his coat and held out a worn envelope. This came to the blacksmith in town. Ms. delivered. Found it last week. Elira took it, hands trembling, and opened the letter. Ma, if this reaches you, I'm sorry it took me so long. I didn't die like they said. I ran. I didn't know how to come back. I didn't think I could. But I never stopped thinking of home. I'll be near the ridge where the second house was meant to be. I'll wait 7 days. L****. She pressed the paper to her chest. This was written weeks ago. Caleb stood. Then he might still be there. I can't go, she said, voice cracking. What if he's not? What if it's just another ghost? He looked down at her, and his voice was quiet as promise. Then I'll go. She looked up at him with something tender and terrified behind her eyes. Why? He swallowed. Because I know what it's like to be lost and hoping someone still waits for you. That night Caleb packed light. Saddlebag, rifle, flask. Elira stood at the gate with her scarf blowing like a flag for the forgotten. She handed him the journal. Her husband's. Whatever you find, she said, bring something home. He nodded, touched her hand, and mounted up. The moon was rising as he rode out, casting silver shadows across the plains. Behind him, the house didn't look haunted anymore. It looked like it was watching. The wind shifted as he passed the ridge. Then, faint, so faint he almost missed it, he saw the smoke from a campfire rising beyond the cedar line. A figure moved there. But just as he turned his horse toward it, something else caught his eye. A second rider, not by the fire, but in the distance, watching him. Waiting. Motionless. The prairie sky was bruised with violet and gold when Evelyn stood at the creek, hem of her dress trailing in the muddy water, arms clutched tightly around her waist. Behind her, the hush of the trees murmured in a language older than sorrow. In her hand was the note, the one tucked beneath her pillow when she'd risen to find Elijah's bed empty, and the door swinging open in the dawn breeze. Don't follow me. Keep the girls safe. I'll send word when I can. Nothing more. No name signed. As if his absence were self-explanatory. As if she hadn't stood beside him in a firelit barn and promised him her soul without words. She stared into the water until the words blurred, soaked by the trembling in her fingers. The twin girls played behind her, oblivious, their laughter echoing against the bank. But Evelyn's chest ached with a terrible stillness, like something inside had cracked and hadn't realized it yet. He'd left before. Gone out to hunt or barter or gather things for the girls. But not like this. Not without saying goodbye. A branch cracked nearby, and Evelyn spun around, heart thudding. Just the wind, just her nerves. But the unease coiled deep. She felt watched. Stalked not by a man, but by fate, something inevitable and cruel, waiting for her to breathe out before it struck. Later that night, after the girls were asleep in the straw bed, Evelyn sat at the hearth, staring into the dull flicker of flame. Elijah's coat still hung on the hook. His hat was still dusted with trailed dirt. Everything remained, but him. Her mind kept turning over his silence. What had she missed? A tremor in his voice? A glance held too long at the edge of the woods? He'd seemed distant the night before, but she thought it was weariness. Now she wondered if it was guilt. The twins shifted in their sleep, and she turned toward them. Their limbs tangled like vines. One murmured something, "Mama," and Evelyn's throat closed. She stood suddenly, crossed to the door, flung it open. The moon lit the clearing with a ghostly glow, casting long shadows from the split-rail fence and the trees beyond. Her breath misted in the cool night air. Somewhere, an owl called, low and mournful. Then movement. Fast. A figure darted from the tree-ling. She stepped back instinctively, hand to her chest, but the figure didn't charge. It stumbled. Collapsed near the old stump. Evelyn rushed forward despite herself, skirts hiked, bare feet thudding the grass. It wasn't Elijah. It was a girl. No older than 13. Clothes torn. Face smeared with dirt and blood. Her lips moved, soundless, eyes wide and unseeing. A bruise marred her temple. One arm hung limp at her side. Evelyn knelt. "You're safe now," she whispered, though she wasn't sure it was true. The girl's eyes flicked toward her, then rolled back. She crumpled unconscious. The next moments were a blur, lifting her, carrying her inside, laying her gently beside the twins. Evelyn wrapped her in the patchwork quilt, checked her breath. Shallow but steady. Fingers cold as creekstone. When dawn came, Evelyn stirred the fire, boiled water, cleaned the girl's wounds with torn cloth and trembling hands. She didn't wake. Not even when Evelyn stitched the gash across her shoulder with thread meant for darning. She worked like a woman possessed, because if she stopped, she'd think about Elijah, and she'd unravel. Later, as sunlight crept over the horizon, the girl stirred. She blinked once, then again, flinching at the sting in her shoulder. Evelyn sat beside her, careful not to hover. "I need to know your name," Evelyn said softly. "I need to know who hurt you." The girl blinked. Her mouth worked. Then she whispered, "Lottie." Evelyn pressed a hand to her own chest, steadying herself. "Lottie. I'm Evelyn. You're safe here." The girl didn't respond. Her eyes had gone distant again, staring at the ceiling like it might fall. The twins woke soon after, peeking at the stranger with wide eyes, but saying nothing. As if they understood instinctively that silence was the kindest offering. Evelyn made broth and fed Lottie in spoonfuls. She didn't ask again. Not yet. Whatever had driven the girl into the woods half dead could wait one more day. That night, Evelyn stood on the porch, lantern light curling around her ankles. The moon had risen again, swollen and low. Somewhere in the forest, wolves called, long and sorrowful. She whispered Elijah's name into the night, not expecting an answer. But she got one. A rustle. A shape beyond the fence line. She stepped down, bare feet sinking into earth. "Elijah?" "Nothing." She moved closer. "If it's you, say something." Then a voice, hoarse, trembling. "Evelyn!" She froze. Her breath hitched. And then he stepped forward, slowly, shoulders slumped, hair tangled with sweat and pine needles. He looked like he'd walked through fire. "Where?" she began, but he raised a shaking hand. "I need to show you something," he said, voice like gravel. She reached for him instinctively, but he pulled away. "Elijah," she whispered, heart breaking anew. "What happened?" He didn't answer. Just turned and gestured for her to follow. She glanced back at the cabin. The girls still slept. Lottie too. Everything felt suspended, like the world was waiting to exhale. Then she stepped off the porch and into the dark. They walked in silence, through trees silvered by moonlight. Evelyn's pulse thudded in her ears. Elijah limped slightly. She noticed he kept one hand pressed to his side. Then they reached it, a clearing she'd never seen before. The earth had been disturbed. Dug up. 3 wooden crosses stood in a row. Fresh. Evelyn stepped closer, mouth dry. The names were scrawled into the wood. Anna. Beatrice. Ruth. Her breath caught. They were missing, Elijah said softly. Lottie's sisters. Evelyn turned to him slowly, her heart breaking as realization swept in like a storm tide. I buried them this morning, he said. They were in the ravine. I found them too late. And for the first time, Evelyn saw the full weight in his eyes, not fear, but fury. Not guilt, but grief. She ran all that way, he said, carrying the memory. And no one else came looking. Evelyn swallowed hard, the night pressing in. And then she knew, the man beside her was not broken. He was rising. And he was going to find whoever did this. And make them wish they never touched those girls.